Okay, so I'm here with Hannah Priest at the Pankhurst Museum. Hi Hannah.
Hi.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
I can introduce myself. So I'm Hannah Priest. I'm the Heritage Engagement Officer here at the Pankhurst Centre, which is on Nelson Street in Charlton on Medlock. So near the university and very, very near the MRI. And so I'm the engagement officer. That means I organise events and school visits and group visits here at the museum.
Okay, great. Can you tell us how the Pankhurst actually ended up in this location?
So this was a family home, and it was a family home that was, I guess, precipitated by tragedy. So Emmeline and Richard Pankhurst had lived in a house in Daisybank Road until Richard's death in 1898 left the family. So Emmeline is now left with 4 children, 3 daughters and a son, and very little money. Richard Pankhurst had done an awful lot of campaigning and pro bono legal work, meaning that there was nothing really for him to leave his widow. And so this house was the property that Emmeline rented to downsize from the house on Daisybank Road and bring her family here. So in 1898 they arrived here, Emmeline and her, as I say, her 3 daughters and her surviving son, and it was a family home. It was this was a home for her and her children, and while she was here she worked as a poor law guardian. She also worked as a registrar of births and deaths. She didn't register marriages. She always said that was because she was a woman and they wouldn't let her. It's not strictly true. And most marriages were done in churches, so they were registered in churches. They weren't done by the registrar. But she actually did run evening sessions as a registrar here in the house for working class women to come after working hours to register births and deaths. Okay. A lot of other registrars would only do it during the working day. So she was already mindful of the particular practicalities that affected women. But this house was then also the site of a rather historic meeting, which changed everything for the Pankhursts. I'm sure you're going to ask me about that in a moment. But that's how they ended up here. This was their home. They rented it. The museum is in one half of a pair of semi-detached Georgian villas. They rented 62. Next door was a man called Archie Webster who ran dance classes. He rented number 60. Carried out his dance teaching there, which I find hilarious that might have disrupted these important political meetings with a bit of foxtrotting going on next door or something. So that's how they ended up on Nelson.
So in 1904, Emmeline created the WSPU?
1903.
1903.
It wasn't called that instantly, but 10th of October 1903, in the room that we're sitting in now, Emmeline had a meeting of some of her friends, close friends. It was a very small group that attended. Christabel attended. Sylvia was away studying. She would get involved later on. And they determined a new campaign, a new approach to fighting the battle for votes for women that would come to be that a few days later they decided on the name, the Women's Social and Political Union. They had another name originally. I can't remember off the top of my head. I can just remember it was really, really long, and so the WSPU was a bit catchier. So Emmeline was a founding member, obviously. Her daughter Christabel was as well, and then some other women that they knew from various other campaigning work and also friends as well. So that happened. There's many reasons why it happened, but one of the things that really pushed them was that after the death of Richard Pankhurst, who'd been a key campaigning figure in the Independent Labour Party and in the Socialist movement, as well as in the suffrage movement, the Independent Labour Party wanted to dedicate a hall to him. They wanted to call a new hall they were building in Salford, Pankhurst Hall, and they wanted murals painted for it. So they commissioned his daughter, Sylvia Pankhurst, a trained artist, to paint murals for the hall, and she did. And it was only on the day that the hall opened that they found out that women wouldn't be allowed to attend all the meetings there. So that is a very personal reason that pushed the Pankhursts onto this. But there were lots of other reasons too. Frustration with the amount of time that this battle had been being fought and the perceived lack of progress that was being made. That was also part of it. It also came out of other campaigning that Emmeline had done. And yes, on 1903, sitting around the table in the parlour, they decided to change all that, and they came up with the slightly catchier named, eventually, Women's Social and Political Union, which was it was a political union. This was a political group. So I think sometimes people think the suffragettes all sort of accidentally turned up to places with toffee hammers and handbags. Actually, no, this was a very, very highly organised political union. You joined. In fact, you're sitting next to a replica of the membership card there. So, and there were paid, the same as you would get in a trade union, there were paid organisers. There were rules about expenses. I found out recently they banked at Barclays, in case you're interested, which bank the suffragettes banked with.
That would probably be controversial now. Right?
Yeah, but they did. They banked at Barclays. They had auditors, they had accounts, they had treasurers and secretaries, and the same as we would expect in any other political or trade union. That developed from that initial meeting in 1903.
Yeah. So, interestingly, I mean, they are the suffragettes, so there's no distinction between the union and the suffragettes. Do you want to tell us how the name suffragettes came to be?
Yeah, it was the tabloids. So the WSPU, the whole point of what they were doing, there were two things really that were different to previous suffrage campaigns and the people that we would call the suffragists, who Emmeline and Richard Pankhurst had been involved with. There were two things different about the WSPU. One is that men couldn't join. So while in the suffragist movement, men who supported votes for women could be part of the campaign, like Richard Pankhurst, in the WSPU it was women only. There were no men allowed membership. And the other, more famously, is that they believed in deeds, not words. And so the plan was to change the tactics that had been used to that point, and to shift the direction. What they became known for was what we call their militant actions, and that came really after about 1905 with the destruction of property and the escalating destruction of property. After the first arrests were made, the tabloids coined the term suffragette, and it's meant to be a derogatory term. It's meant to, the "et" bit on the end suggesting a little woman, so a little woman who likes suffrage. And the WSPU embraced it and adopted it, called their magazine the Suffragette, called themselves suffragettes, and just completely and utterly reclaimed it and turned it into a name that had power to it, rather than what it was intended to be, which was a bit of a kind of derogatory comment on them.
So, talking about suffragists and suffragettes, I mean, as being part of the Clarion Cycling Club, like Robert Blatchford, he was the founder of the Clarion newspaper, and he was campaigning for men or working class men to get the vote. So what was the interaction like between suffragettes and suffragists at the time?
So Emmeline Pankhurst had come through this sort of suffragist campaigns. She probably went to her first suffragist meeting in when she was about 14 or 15 as a teenager. Sophia Golden, Emmeline's mother, took her to the Free Trade Hall here in Manchester to see Lydia Becker, the absolute icon of the suffragist movement. And Lydia completely infused Emmeline with this fervour to fight for votes for women. Now that brings her then into these circles that you're talking about. They're sort of almost like overlapping circles, aren't they, of the men's suffrage campaign, because sometimes it's easy to forget that at this time not all men had the vote. Most men didn't have the vote. The women's suffrage campaign, but also the Independent Labour Party, the Clarion, these socialist and social reform groups. And so Emmeline and Richard Pankhurst were moving in these overlapping circles. The WSPU was really a bit of a break with some, so it did entail some arguments and some falling out. And that continued as well, because the suffragist campaign for votes for women didn't go away. Millicent Fawcett just didn't magically disappear. And there was Charlotte Despard as well, and her Women's Freedom League as well. So these campaigns were going on. At times, everyone would come together. So a good example of that's 1913 and the suffrage pilgrimage. Ellen Wilkinson was involved in organising at Hyde Park. There were people there who were both suffragists and suffragettes. At other times it could be a little bit more acrimonious and a little bit more. And on one occasion, Charlotte Despard essentially poached a suffragette from Emmeline when Hannah Mitchell, who was an organiser for the WSPU, fell ill, and Emmeline didn't even send her a get well soon card. Charlotte Despard did, and looked after her, and Hannah Mitchell switched to the Women's Freedom League from the WSPU. So this was going on all the time, but I think it's probably for those of us who are used to social movements, who are used to political movements, we know that sometimes you come together and sometimes you're apart, and sometimes your internal disagreements overshadow everything else that you're trying to do to change the world. So I'm not sure it's particularly alien to anyone who's been around political groups and movements.
Interestingly, I think the suffragettes are a lot more famous than the suffragists in history. Were the suffragettes the most militant of the two groups? Can you give us example how far their militancy actually went?
Bombs, blowing up property, setting fire to property. That's how far it went on the offensive side of things. So I think that's what the suffragettes are known for. Certainly breaking windows is definitely what suffragettes are known for. But they did, so here in Manchester, they blew up the Cactus House at Alexandra Park, for instance. It was always focused on property. That was absolutely a key part of the WSPU, to make sure that any buildings that were damaged were empty beforehand. However, it was quite full on. Some of the campaigns they did, and they made explosives. That's one side. The other side, and I think this is something that suffragettes are known for, is the hunger strikes. So when they were imprisoned, they weren't treated as political prisoners. So to protest against that, they went on hunger strike. And then the king, actually, I think, just trying to teach them a lesson, said, right, fine, well, we will treat you as political prisoners then. And political prisoners on hunger strike are force-fed. And so they were force-fed. And I think so those are the extremes of where we know that obviously women died. Women died as a result of force feeding. And I think most people are familiar with the story of Emily Wilding Davison, who was killed after falling under the King's horse at the Derby race, which was probably an accident. She wasn't throwing herself in front of the horse. She was trying to disrupt the race.
I think there was a documentary being made where the suggestion was that she actually tried to put a ribbon onto the horse rather than... So the idea was that she did not intend to kill... get killed in the action.
However, other women died. Emmeline's own sister died, probably as a result of the health concerns caused by continuous hunger strikes and force feeding. A lot of suffragettes' health was really badly damaged by what they were doing. So that's another extreme that they would go to. Different from the suffragists who, as you say, are probably not as well known. And there's probably a very good reason for that. I don't know if this is something that you're going to ask me, but that suffragettes were much better at working the media. And we sometimes joke now that if Emmeline, or certainly Christabel, was alive now, she'd be an influencer. They knew how to do the publicity. The suffragists didn't do anything that would be sell newspapers, but the suffragettes were always selling newspapers. And there's quite a lot of evidence that some of this was really carefully planned. They were very media savvy. They knew what they... So, for example, the first arrest in 1905, you look at the women who were first arrested, and they're young and sweet and genteel looking and dressed very respectably, because then they got the media coverage of women like that, who could be your daughter, your sister, your cousin, being carted off by police officers. An awful lot of the pictures of Emmeline Pankhurst are they're really carefully planned media campaign, and it was to shift the perception. But what that has done is it's meant that for some people who maybe don't know their history or the political history, they think that the suffragettes came out of nowhere, that there was no one else campaigning for votes for women, that there was no one campaigning for votes for men, and that's not true. They were just our group who happened to be the most radical and the best at getting on the front page of the papers.
Okay. I mean, I'm quite interested in protest, and it's interesting to see how militant those women were. And then it's interesting to see, I'm going to ask you about media reaction at the time, but it's also interesting for me to see how groups nowadays, like Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion, they haven't done anything as militant yet as those women have done. And the media, or certain parts of the media, are down on them.
I think there is definitely a modern day comparison though, and her name is Greta. I think she knows how to do the media the way Greta Thunberg knows how to do the media the way that Emmeline does. I actually saw the picture of her most recent arrest. And she's posing like Emmeline Pankhurst. I really want to put the two pictures together, because there's a really similar photograph taken of Emmeline Pankhurst getting arrested. And I think the media perception of the suffragettes is very similar to, if we compare Greta Thunberg to Emmeline Pankhurst, some papers despise her and will say anything. Other papers, if you take, for example, the difference between the way the Daily Mail reports on and the way the Guardian reports on it, it's very different, isn't it? And the same was true for the suffragettes, that there were some papers that were more sympathetic, more supportive. There were some that were more gently mocking, and some that would present it as if this was the worst thing that could possibly happen to society. And this would shift as well occasionally when things happened. So when the Cat and Mouse Act came out in 1913 as well, and when the Cat and Mouse Act came out, which was the act that said that when women were on hunger strike, if their health was failing as a result of either the hunger strike or forced feeding, they were to be released back to their house to recover and then rearrested to serve the end of their sentence. Obviously, funnily enough, not all of them were in their house when the police came to rearrest them. Hence, Cat and Mouse Act. You know that they were the idea was that it wasn't called a Cat and Mouse Act, by the way, but it was known as that in the popular press, because the idea was that the state was sort of like the cat toying with the mouse, letting it go and catching it again. But actually the suffragettes treated it a little bit more like Tom and Jerry, that the mouse is constantly outsmarting the cat. when that came out, and when some of the descriptions of force feeding particularly came out, you see a little bit of newspapers shifting more to I don't agree with what they do, but nobody should treat them like that attitude. But then when there's a big campaign of vandalism, you see the newspapers being less sympathetic.
A bit like when Greenpeace targeted the Prime Minister's house, I suppose.
Yeah. So I think there's parallels. I suspect perhaps some modern groups might want to look at the suffragettes, look at the media, look at what they put out themselves and the ways that they were, because there's a lot of really interesting parallels and lessons that can be learnt there. And I'd suspect if Greta Thunberg hasn't seen the picture of Emmeline being arrested, that was a huge coincidence, because she managed to get it just right.
Okay, so we cycled to Boggart Hole Clough, and Boggart Hole Clough has got a connection with Emmeline Pankhurst. Can you tell us about that?
So Emmeline Pankhurst and Richard Pankhurst both attended protests in Boggart Hole Clough in the 1890s. So Boggart Hole Clough, for anyone who doesn't know, now it's a large municipal park. It's the third biggest park in Manchester, council-run park in Manchester. It's in North Manchester. It's in Blakely, not too far from the border with Middleton. In the 1890s, it was transitioning from a space that had been the estate of the Hall of Booth Hall, with a fairly absent landlord, into it was bought by the council, by the corporation in 1893. It had got this tradition of being a gathering place for large gatherings, meetings, rallies, however you want to call them. And like a lot of spaces in Manchester, that was a bit contested. That was quite, ever since Peterloo, which was the big public space where people held rallies and it went bad. Ever since Peterloo, there had been a lot of conflict around who was allowed to gather where, what political meetings could be held where. Boggart Hole Clough was one of those spaces, a little bit like Kersal Moor on Salford side. And the various social movements, particularly for this story, the Independent Labour Party, held their rallies at Boggart Hole Clough, partly because there was space, actually 100% because there was space. And that's how Emmeline, so a lot of people think that she was at Boggart Hole Clough for a suffragette rally. It wasn't, it was Independent Labour Party meetings. She spoke alongside Keir Hardie. Now what happened then was that Manchester Corporation prosecuted them, and Keir Hardie and Emmeline Pankhurst and others as well were prosecuted by Manchester Corporation, and it was such a huge thing because it was all about the right to be political in a public space, that it made national news. It made it was discussed in the House of Commons. It was so that's what she was doing at Boggart Hole Clough, and that's why she was prosecuted. And I think that in a way gave her the taste for more militant campaigning. So the two sort of strands going into what made Emmeline Pankhurst by 1903 was the suffragist campaigns of people like Lydia Becker, but also the slightly more militant socialism of people like Keir Hardie. Keir Hardie had been to prison, and he'd done hard labour, and it's the suffragettes then go and hunger strike. It's a similar sort of sacrificing yourself to the cause. They knew that they were never, as women, going to be sentenced to hard labour, but they could still do something like that, sacrifice themselves to the cause. So I think it's that radical background is coming from that interaction with the Independent Labour Party and other social, other social and democratic groups around that. So that's what led her to Boggart Hole Clough, and she was allegedly chased by a mob. Allegedly chased by the police.
But not by a boggart.
She might have been chased by a boggart. There's a particularly nasty boggart on the one side of Boggart Hole Clough called Nutnan, but that's for a completely different YouTube video.
Great. She came back to Boggart Hole Clough specifically to talk about the suffragettes. Was it in the 1910s though as well? So she obviously liked the place because she could,
once again, going to point out how much space there is there. She also went to Heaton Park, which is the biggest park in Manchester. By that point, she was commanding an audience that needed a big park.
Yeah.
But she obviously liked it, yes, she obviously did. Well, you've been there yourself, you've cycled there, you know what it's like.
Yes.
It's a nice place.
Yeah, I still don't know where exactly it was, and I think you are campaigning, or a group is campaigning to actually have some kind of memorial.
I think the council are intending to, so maybe it's to say sorry for prosecuting her all those years ago, but I think the council are intending to mark it. To actually mark it on the fence, where we're fairly certain it is, because when the prosecutions happened in the 1890s, it was such a huge thing. There was an awful lot of documentation about the case, and fortunately for us, there is a chart of Boggart Hole Clough with an X marking where they were speaking. So we can. All you've got to do is match one map with another.
Talking about the statue, do you think in 1928 there would have been people would actually have erected a statue for Emmeline Pankhurst?
I have to say no, and I have to say it not probably not for the reason you're expecting me to say it, because there aren't that many statues of women erected even today, never mind in 1920. You think about the campaign that had to happen to get the Emmeline Pankhurst statue in Manchester, and we're now seeing campaigns for the second statue of a woman that isn't Queen Victoria. And so no, but probably not because she was too radical, but just because people wouldn't put up statues of women. There were some campaigns immediately after her death, more in London, because obviously a huge amount of the higher profile suffragette campaign was run after she'd left Manchester and moved in 1906 and moved to London. So there were campaigns immediately after her death for various memorials, statues or plaques or things like that. So it was happening, and I think the perception at the time was actually far warmer to her by 1928 than perhaps if someone had said they were going to put a statue up of her in 1910, 1913, might have gone down differently. But it's taken a lot of work, but that's true for getting any commemorations of the achievements of women, I have to say.
Like talking about the right of women to vote becoming law, how much impact did the suffragette movement have on that? Because there are some voices who say it's only because there was a war that women got to vote, and it would have happened anyway. What do you think about that position?
We'll never know because it happened. We can't look at an alternative timeline. There were people at the time who were saying that as well, but the fact is that the suffragettes had lived through this. Emmeline Pankhurst went to see Lydia Becker speak at the Free Trade Hall in probably 1874. She went, and ever from that moment on, there was every couple of years it was, don't worry, a bill's going to Parliament, don't worry, we're going to get it through Parliament. Oh no, sorry, it couldn't go to Parliament this time, or we had to change for this reason. So saying it would have happened anyway, we can't know that, and the suffragettes just couldn't continue. The women who joined the WSPU just couldn't continue with these promises. Don't worry, it will happen. Don't worry, it will happen. Because it didn't look like to them it would. Obviously the impact of the First World War we saw in changes to both women's and men's suffrage.
Yeah.
We know what would have happened if that World War didn't happen. What the suffragettes certainly did was change the perception of the Votes for Women campaign. They shifted public perception for good and for bad, and they made it into a thing that everyone was talking about. It was on everyone's lips, and that every politician had to stay on their toes about. I'm going to tell you my favourite story about a politician staying on his toes at the moment. I'm sure I'll have another one. In 1910, there's 1909 actually, in the run-up to the general election, Winston Churchill had been asked to go to Southport to speak in favour of the candidate in the election. And Winston Churchill, while not opposed to Votes for Women by all accounts, he did not agree with the way the suffragette campaign worked. He didn't agree with the suffragettes. So he only agreed to speak at the theatre if they could guarantee no suffragettes. And so they vetted everyone, they vetted every ticket holder, they checked them all out. I don't know how, I mean now we'd just look on their social media, wouldn't we? But they checked them all out. And so when Winston Churchill arrived to speak, they could say, the theatre owner said to him, "Don't worry, we can guarantee there are no suffragettes in this audience." Because that's how worried he was about having one woman jump up and say Votes for Women. That's how frightened he was. Of course, the theatre owner had forgotten to check the roof where the suffragettes had been hiding for the previous 15 hours, and they jumped out in the middle of the speech. But that's how present they were making the issue. That's how much they were keeping politicians like Winston Churchill vigilant about it.
Is it one good reason to give them a vote so they don't have to be scared of suffragettes jumping
exactly.
at them, I suppose?